I'm sitting here with Robert McDonald, my father, on his 75th birthday. The first question I'm going to ask is what was it like being the youngest of 11 children?
Well, I was always called the baby, which I didn't particularly care for. And my dad, when he was 90 and I was 50, was still introducing me to people as his baby. But there were good things about it too, because my mom spoiled me a little bit more than the other kids. So they always accused me of being mom's favorite. I'm not sure I was. I think she had 11 favorites.
How many were out of the house by the time you were around and kicking? There's quite a,
There
a
were typically
span in
there
between you guys.
growing up. Most of the time, there were six of us left in the house, and four or five of them had already moved out and been married by the time of probably most of my early memories. Mary and Diana were up there and in the attic, and Annie and Maggie, and then and Pat and I, we were still home. The others, Chuck and Tony and Carol and Sheila and Judy, they were all out of the house and married.
Were they more like kind of like you would think an uncle or aunt would be to a kid rather than a sibling relationship?
Well, yeah, it in some ways our own family, my own siblings, were kind of split into two groups. There was the first seven, and then there was a gap for 3 or 4 years before Pat was born, and so then there was the last four. So I used to go out to my brother Chuck's house, and the summer times, and stay for a week or so, and play with his kids, Fritz and Jim in particular. Where Fritz was 11 months younger than I, so I played a lot with his kids. So in some ways, it was more of a uncle type relationship with my brother Chuck in particular.
And most of your siblings finished up in the Catholic school system. Can you tell a little bit about the Catholic school system that you attended growing up?
Well, we lived in the St. Vincent parish, and that area of the near west side of Akron was uh, predominantly Irish Catholic families, and the parish there at St. Vincent had their own grade school and a high school, and so most of us went to both schools, the grade school and the high school. But my older siblings, Chuck and Tony and Carol in particular, went to St. Mary's for high school. And St. Mary's was in more in the downtown Akron area. And my brother Pat went to Hoban, but we all went to St. Vincent Elementary School, which was run by the Dominicans, and they uh, were very strict. And we were raised in the Catholic Church, so we went to church every Sunday, and uh, mom was a pretty devout Catholic prior to Vatican II, especially. She would get up in the mornings on weekdays and go to church at 6 o'clock in the morning. Walk up to the church that's a couple blocks away and go to mass, and then come home. And what they did at that time is the priest could hurry up the mass if they wanted to. So a lot of times for the 6 a.m. mass, they had working fathers or housewives that had to get back home, and so they would say the mass in like 30 minutes. So it would take her overall probably maybe less than an hour a day she would devote. But she went to mass pretty much every weekday, 6 a.m. for a long time.
So when you were in school then, because I attended public school and my brother attended public school, and Eileen, our sister, kind of was half and half there. Did you have religious classes within that school system, and were you taught by? I mean, what was the percentage that you were taught by nuns or fathers, or what was that like?
Well, in the grade school in particular, the bulk of the faculty were Dominican nuns, but there were lay teachers, and I had several lay teachers who were Um, Mostly women. There were a couple, as I remember, there was probably one man teacher who was not religious. He was a layman who taught, and then there were probably they had 8 grades in the school, and there were 2 classes in each grade. So there were about 16 teachers plus some administrators. So let's just say roughly 20 faculty members in the elementary school, and probably 12 or 13 of them were nuns, and then there were maybe 5 or 6 female lay teachers and one male lay teacher. So predominantly you were taught by nuns, and the religion class was a part of every day, and you had prayers before school when you started school, and um, they would play. We would play at noontime in the parking lot there, and when the bells would ring at noon, you had to stop and stand there and kind of think about God or whatever, you know. So there was a pretty much a religious component undermined, or was an undertone of everything that about that education.
Were there kids who went to school, either in elementary or in high school, that were not part of the Catholic faith, that were just kids from the neighborhood that wanted to go to that environment?
I think there were a few, but not very many.
And you mentioned a little bit about your mom, which I appreciate. I never got a chance to meet your mom. Can you tell me a little bit more about her? Like, what was she like as a, just as a human being or a friend, or what was she like? That's a
Well,
big question.
I have had an old neighborhood friend who years later uh, we were became Facebook friends, and I put a picture of my mom and I out there from our wedding, and he put a response out there, and he defined my mother in one word, which was extremely accurate, and that word was gentle. Uh, Mom was a very religious person, but was a gentle person and kind and loving. She had a little bit of a fierce streak when it came to the family. You know, the family was very important to her. So she would fiercely defend her siblings and her children and her grandchildren. So she was a strong woman. I think she went through 8th grade of school. I don't think she went beyond that, maybe ninth grade at the most. So she was self educated, and she was extremely bright and very witty. And she had that Irish gift of blarney. She would laugh. She had an uproarious laugh that was really, you couldn't believe that a laugh like that would come out of such a tiny person. Mom was small and frail, and she was 44 when I was born, so I didn't really know much about her as a younger person. And, she was old to me in a lot of ways because she was a lot older. And in most of my lifetime growing up, I know she was somewhat frail. She was strong, but uh, physically wasn't very powerful, I would say. So, but
And she was competitive. Did she like playing cards and doing the things that you and your siblings seem to like to do?
well, she spent most of her time doing chores that she probably should have delegated to the kids. She was in the kitchen all the time, and she wasn't a very good cook, and we didn't have many spices in the house. I think maybe she just grew up that way, and we got a lot of boiled potatoes and plain spaghetti and crazy things that people these days wouldn't have. But we didn't have many spices there, but she was cooking all the time. And when she wasn't cooking, she was doing laundry or doing dishes. So um, that was her, I think in some ways her chosen lot in life was to be a housewife and to be the best housewife she could be. Uh, it was a challenge. I'm sure, I don't remember, but I know she had to be cleaning diapers for years, with
Yeah.
11 kids in 19 years time span. She was doing diapers and laundry all the time.
One thing I've always admired about you and mom is that how close you've kept your friends for all these years. And I wonder, did they have your father and your mother, did they have certain social circle, whether with siblings of theirs or their friends? Like who did they have time to hang out or go places with, or was there some of that?
Yeah, mom came from a big family. I think there were 9 of them. And so they got together on several occasions. And my aunts Betty and Grace in particular were spinsters, and they both worked at Firestone, and they had good jobs, and they helped finance a lot of the other siblings and their nieces and nephews and stuff with on occasion. And so there was a real tightness in my mother's family. They were very close to each other. And dad's family was a little more aloof, and they were remote. When we were growing up, my dad's brother was in Atlanta, and his sister was
She was around for a while, right? But then they
there. Well, she lived in Minnesota for a while,
okay.
and she lived in Florida for a while, and she lived in Atlanta for a while, but they were never around Akron. And by the time I was growing up, my grandparents, my dad's family, they lived in Florida, so we really didn't see or hear much from them. They would send packages every Christmas time. We get a big package of grapefruits and oranges from Florida, and you know they kept in touch, but not a lot. But my mom's family was very close, and so we did things with some of our cousins, and my older siblings lived when we lived on Hall Street. I had the Eads and the Collinses lived right across the street. So that was my uncle Bob Collins and his family, and my Aunt Ruth Ead, and they lived right across the street from where we lived, and my grandparents lived across the street as well. They had the grandparents lived in one house which was directly across the street from us, and then next door to that was a twinplex where the Eads and the Bob Collins family lived. So my older siblings actually lived with my cousins. Now, by the time I was grown up, the Eads and the Bob Collins family had relocated. So growing up for my siblings, there was a lot of interaction with our cousins. For me, not so much. We saw the Eads, of course, every day in school. Um, Janet was a year behind me, but there were 9 Ead children, and there was almost one to match every one of our kids. So we saw them a lot in school. Um, my dad was very active in the Ancient Order of Hibernians, an Irish Catholic organization, and he was a president there for a couple of years in the 1960s. And my parents spent a lot of time there. It was a social outlet for them, and they could be with their own kind, so to
Yeah,
speak.
like-minded people,
It was
Catholic Irish heritage.
was one of the things that my mother's one of her philosophies was to stick to your own kind, which in their day and age made a lot of sense because people helped each other. Somebody would get sick or have a baby, and their friends or people from their parish or family would help each other out. So there was an element during the Depression and post-Depression and World War II and all those things where it made a lot of sense to stick with your own kind. And today that doesn't make as much sense as it used to. But so they belonged to the Hibernians, and there were a lot of Irish. It was all Irish people. You had to be Irish to get in, and uh, they were very active in that organization. Matter of fact, my dad was one of the first people who they gave a lifetime membership to, which was quite an honor at that time.
And Uncle Chuck was one of the founders. Is that right? He helped set up the charter, I believe, with like a
When
dozen
the
other guys or so.
when
I
the
remember
club
this
got
story.
started, my brother Chuck was one of the original charter members. There were about a dozen of them. And, he was, I believe, he was an Akron policeman at the time, but
Right.
some of the early members, the first members, were Akron policemen, and Chuck was one of the first members.
Okay. Well, you mentioned I was going to ask a little bit about the differences in Akron then and now. I know traditionally, if that near west side was Irish, then the north side was predominantly Italian. You had a German neighborhood, which is kind of close to where Akron U is now, and there's remnants of that are still around. They have the German American Club or Polish American Club or Janota Club or Hibernian Club. Like those things are, I guess, still hanging on. But do you want to reflect on some of the changes that you've seen in the city since? I mean, you lived in the city of Akron of almost 70 years. I mean, until your retirement, basically. So, what are some of the changes that you've seen in your lifetime?
Well, our neighborhood in particular was predominantly Irish Catholic. Um, there were others. We had an Italian family lived right next door to us, and my friend Don Russo lived around the corner, and he was Italian, and his cousins lived right up the street, and they were Italian. So they weren't all Irish people, but they were almost all Catholic people, and they were all St. Vincent people, pretty much. The Russos was kind of a unique family that Donald's father and his uncle, who was his father's brother, married two sisters. So those two families were very close, and they lived about four houses apart from each other over on Crestwood. And we got big families. The Marshalls had like 10 kids, and the Bars had 14 kids, and there were a lot of kids growing up in our neighborhood. And the neighborhood there has changed with the times. People moved out, they grew up, they moved out, the older people died off, and so the neighborhood has changed. They're big houses, but they kind of went down in value for a time, and the neighborhood got a little rougher, and so it's not the same as it was. Akron itself has changed too. Back in those days, almost everybody worked in the rubber shop. You know, either Firestone or General or Goodrich or Goodyear. That's where their dads worked. And my aunts actually worked at Firestone. So there were some women in the workplace, and not many. Most of them were housewives, but uh, pretty much everybody was working in the rubber shops.
What was that like? Just the smell or the look of it? Is that a noticeable difference if you've been zoomed from 1968 to right now? What would you notice eh, just in the air, in the atmosphere?
Well, they it was a dirty place to live in a lot of ways. There was a lot of soot in the air and stuff, and some of the rubber shops in the later years took to discharging their waste at night, so you didn't see it as much. But in the early years, there was a smell and uh, of the rubber that kind of permeated the air, and you would look at St. Vincent Church in particular was black, and that's the way I always remembered it. The outside of the church was black. Well, back in the I don't know the 1980s or early 1990s, they sandblasted the church, and I found out that it was actually a beige color. So that's soot and rubber waste was getting in people's lungs and everything for years. And Akron, the one guy, Albrecht, he owned Acme, and he called it the smell of money. And that's what it was, because that's how everybody made their living. They were working in the rubber shop. Some people were making tires, some people were making uh, other rubber products, and those were dirty jobs.
See, and
Some jobs were dirtier than others.
all right. So what I'm going to do with this part is I'm going to hand you some items, and then I'm going to get your reaction about those things, and then we can just talk about whatever comes up. Okay.
Sure.
All right. 1 second. I'm going to put something on your lap. And then I'm going to have you open your eyes. All right. Okay. All right. Go ahead and open your eyes. So, what those things belong to your grandfather, and one is his little satchel. And then, if you can open this other side it opens from the side that's facing me.
Okay.
There's not much in there, but if you can open this box here.
Okay.
So your grandfather was an artist and a painter. Oh yeah, it's a little rusty.
I got it.
He was an artist and a painter.
Yeah.
And that's his painting box and painting palettes. So in what ways is art, and he was a piano player as well, in what ways has art and music kind of been important in our family legacy?
Well, my grandfather, again, I wasn't very close to him, and he was a lot older than me, but he did oil paintings, and pretty much everybody in the family has an oil painting, which my grandfather gave to my dad, and then he gave him to different ones of his children. And we have one. We have a painting, and it's probably the last one he ever did. But we had his paintings in our house growing up. There were particularly two. One was a beautiful Cuyahoga River scene in the fall, really nice. And he had some knack. I don't know how he did it, but the river kind of went around a corner. And when you walked in different areas of the house and looked at that painting, you could kind of go around the corner. It was some visual effect. I don't know how he did it, but it was really impressive. And the other painting we had was a clipper ship.
Are there brushes in there? Can you pull some of those out as you? Well, and those are his tools.
Yeah, he's got these things here, and there's a brush. Yeah, and he painted, and so we had art in the house. I don't think any of my siblings were particularly good at art, but my brother-in-law Joe Berner, who married my sister Sheila, he was a professional artist, and his work is magnificent. And he actually worked for an advertising agency in Chicago, and he made his living on art. And so there was a connection of art in our family, but more, there was a lot more connection to music. We had an old spinet piano that was in our hallway, which was a room right up as it came in the house. It was right directly to your right as soon as you walked in the house. And there was a spinet piano there, and Mom would play. She played a lot of 40s songs, and we had a piano bench, and the bench was filled with sheet music. you could open it up, and inside there was sheet music, and then you get the songs you wanted to play, and put them on the stand on the piano, and close the bench and sit on the bench and play the music. So mom played a lot of the old 40s songs, and most of my siblings took music lessons in school. I did not, but I think all the other ones did. Pat took violin for about a month, I think. He said that was enough. But Maggie, in particular, uh, took piano lessons all the way through high school, and she was taught by a nun named Sister Lucille. And Sister Lucille was the music teacher in the elementary school, and she gave private lessons to people, after school or whatever. And Maggie took lessons for all the way through high school and became very proficient and could play. Some of my other siblings played things like the tin whistle, or Diana played the trumpet. She was in the band at St. Vincent. And so there were other instruments. Carol played the violin. And um, so there was a lot of music in our house and a lot of singing. And the music, it brought a lot of joy to the family. We would, you know, they were old tunes that were, hits back in the 40s and late 40s and early 50s. We would be playing them all the time and singing, and um, sometimes we'd have parties and the piano was a focal point. So there was a lot of music in our house, and there was also music in the church. It was a big part of the religious ceremonies was the music. So Maggie actually played the organ in the church for a while, and she played the organ late years later in the Episcopal Church. So we had a lot of music in our house growing up. Art, we have more art in with my family, with Patrick and you and Chris, and we had more art. And Eileen did music, and I always felt it was important to uh, to encourage that because it brings a lot of joy to a lot of people.
Yeah, I was going to add that we, although I did some singing and do some music now, and I didn't really we didn't do instruments growing up, but Eileen did the violin, and of course Pat is gallery represented artist, and he has done fantastic works, and Chris has done some sculpture and whatnot. So the fact that you all nurtured that atmosphere um, has been great.